The bitter cold of space was something Mike Anderson had learned to live with during his 3 years on mining station Delta 7. But tonight was different. Tonight, the cold wasn't just outside, it was creeping in. Mike's breath formed small clouds in front of his face as he stared at the main control panel. Red warning lights blinked everywhere, telling the same story. The station's primary power core had failed. The backup systems were struggling to maintain even basic life support. "This is bad," he muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The temperature display showed -15 degrees Celsius and dropping. The standard heating systems were already dead, and the emergency heaters were using up what little power remained. Being the only human on board a deep space mining station wasn't supposed to be this dangerous. The company had assured him it was his simple job: maintain the equipment, monitor the automated mining drones, and make sure nothing broke down. They forgot to mention what would happen when everything broke down at once. The station creaked around him as metal contracted in the growing cold. Mike pulled his standard-issue jacket tighter, but it wasn't designed for these temperatures. His fingers were starting to feel stiff as he typed out another emergency message to Earth. Station Delta 7. Emergency situation. Primary power failure. Temperature critical. Request immediate assistance. The message joined dozens of others he'd sent in the last hour. The communication system was still working, barely, but solar interference meant it would take hours for any response to reach him. Hours he might not have. A soft thud from behind made him jump. Mike turned to see Vex, the station's alien environmental specialist, ducking through the control room doorway. At 8 feet tall and covered in thick, rust-colored fur, Vex looked like a cross between a bear and a kangaroo. If bears or kangaroos had 4 arms and silver eyes. "Power systems failing," Vex stated in their oddly musical voice. "Temperature dropping. This is dangerous for humans." Mike couldn't help but smile despite the situation. Vex had a talent for stating the obvious. "Yeah, you could say that. I'm trying to reroute power from non-essential systems, but there's not much left to work with." Vex moved closer, and Mike felt a wave of warmth. The alien species naturally maintained a body temperature of around 40 degrees Celsius, something about their home planet's unusual orbit requiring them to generate their own heat. "My internal sensors indicate the temperature will reach fatal levels for humans within 3 hours, Vex said, their silver eyes blinking with concern. "You require immediate heating." "Working on it," Mike said through chattering teeth. He'd already put on every piece of warm clothing he had, but it wasn't enough. The cold was getting worse, and his movements were becoming slower. Warning signs of hypothermia that he remembered from his survival training. Vex watched him work for several minutes, their head tilted in that peculiar way that meant they were thinking hard about something. Finally, they spoke again. "I have solution. I'm open to suggestions," Mike said, rubbing his hands together to keep the blood flowing. "Sleep next to me." Mike's fingers froze over the keyboard. "What?" "My body heat will keep you alive," Vex explained, as if it was the most natural suggestion in the world. "I won't let you die, human. Sleep next to me." Mike stared at the alien, trying to process what they were suggesting. The rational part of his brain knew it made sense. Vex was essentially a walking furnace, but the idea of cuddling up to an 8-foot-tall alien was, well, it wasn't covered in his training manual. Another warning light blinked on, and the temperature display dropped another degree. Mike looked at his shaking hands, then at Vex's concerned face. He had to make a decision soon. His pride versus his survival. The station groaned again in the cold, and somewhere in the distance, another system failed with a dull thud. Mike took a deep breath. "Let me try one more thing with the power systems first." But as he turned back to the controls, he knew he was running out of both options and time. And Vex's offer was starting to sound less strange and more like his only chance of survival. The control room's temperature had dropped another 5 degrees in the last 30 minutes. Mike's fingers were so numb he could barely type, and each breath felt like inhaling ice. The emergency heating system had finally given up, leaving them with only the faint red glow of warning lights. Last attempt failed, Mike admitted, his voice shaking from the cold. He tried everything he could think of to restore power, but nothing worked. The mining station's systems were frozen, literally and figuratively. Vex had been watching him the entire time, their silver eyes reflecting the dim emergency lights. The alien's rust-colored fur seemed to ripple with concern as they observed Mike's deteriorating condition. "Your body temperature is reaching dangerous levels," Vex stated, moving closer. "You are shivering severely. This is a sign of hypothermia in humans." Mike tried to laugh, but it came out as more of a wheeze. "You've been studying human biology, I see." "Required learning for all deep space workers," Vex responded. "Especially important for environmental specialists. Now you must accept my help." Mike watched as Vex began clearing a space in the corner of the control room, pushing aside loose equipment and laying down some emergency blankets they'd retrieved from a storage locker. The aliens' movements were precise and purposeful, like everything they did. "Look, Vex, I appreciate the offer, but," Mike started, trying to think of a polite way to decline. "You are concerned about physical contact," Vex interrupted, their head tilted in that curious way again. "This is a human cultural trait, but this is survival, not social interaction." Mike blinked, surprised by Vex's directness. "It's not just that. It's complicated." "No, not complicated," Vex insisted. "Simple biology. My body temperature is 40 degrees Celsius. Your body temperature is dropping below safe levels. Solution is obvious." As if to emphasize the point, another wave of violent shivers hit Mike. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of a console. Vex moved with surprising speed, their forearms ready to catch him if he fell. "In my culture," Vex continued, their musical voice softer now, "sharing warmth is sacred duty. To deny warmth to one who needs it would be—" They paused, searching for the right word. "Unthinkable." Mike looked at the makeshift bed Vex had prepared, then at his own trembling hands. The logical part of his brain knew Vex was right. This wasn't about comfort or social norms. It was about staying alive. "How exactly would this work?" he asked finally. Vex's ears perked up. A sign Mike had learned meant they were pleased. "Simple. You lie here." They gestured to the blankets. "I curl around you. My fur and body heat will keep you warm until help arrives." Mike took an unsteady step toward the blankets. "And this is really normal for your species." "More than normal. It is expected. On my world, during cold seasons, everyone shares warmth. We live in large family groups, all sleeping together. No one sleeps alone in the cold." There was something oddly comforting about the way Vex explained it. It reminded Mike of stories his grandfather used to tell about frontier families huddling together during winter storms. Another violent shiver ran through him, and this time his legs actually buckled. Vex caught him easily with their lower set of arms. "No more discussion," Vex said firmly. "You can barely stand. Time for pride is over. Time for survival is now." Mike nodded weakly, finally accepting the inevitable. Okay, you win. But if anyone ever asks, this was strictly a survival situation." "Of course," Vex agreed, helping him to the blankets. "Though I do not understand why humans are embarrassed by accepting help. Is very inefficient." Despite everything, Mike found himself smiling as he lay down. "That's humans for you. We're complicated." "Yes," Vex said, carefully arranging themselves around him, "but worth keeping alive." The effect was immediate, like lying next to a furry space heater. Mike felt warmth seeping back into his frozen limbs, and for the first time in hours, he stopped shivering. "Thank you," he whispered. "Sleep, human," Vex replied. "I will keep watch, and keep you warm." The first hour was the most awkward. Mike lay rigid, trying to maintain some sense of personal space, while still benefiting from Vex's incredible body heat. The alien's fur was surprisingly soft, and despite his best efforts to stay professional about the situation, he found himself relaxing as warmth returned to his frozen limbs. "Your heart rate is still elevated," Vex observed, their voice rumbling through their chest. "Are you still cold?" "No, just adjusting," Mike replied, trying to find a comfortable position. "This isn't exactly a normal day at work." A sudden bang echoed through the station, followed by the distinctive sound of another system failing. The lights flickered ominously, and Mike instinctively tried to get up. "Stay," Vex commanded, using one of their 4 arms to gently but firmly keep Mike in place. "Nothing can be done now. Systems must wait." "But if the life support already failed," Vex interrupted. "Only minimal oxygen recycling remains. Moving around wastes energy and heat. Logic says stay still." Mike reluctantly settled back down. "How can you be so calm about this?" "Because panic serves no purpose," Vex replied. "And because I have faith in human engineering. Your species builds backup systems for backup systems. Some part of station will keep working until help arrives." Another crash somewhere in the distance made Mike wince. "You might be overestimating human engineering right now." "No. I have studied your species' history. Humans survive. Always survive. Very stubborn about it." There was a hint of amusement in Vex's musical voice. The station creaked around them, metal contracting in the increasing cold. Mike was grateful for Vex's warmth now. The temperature display on the nearest working console showed -25 degrees Celsius. "Tell me about your world," Mike said, trying to distract himself from their situation. "You mentioned cold seasons earlier." "Yes. My planet orbits binary stars. Complex orbit creates long cold seasons. My species evolved to generate internal heat and share it." Vex shifted slightly, adjusting their position to better cover Mike. "Young ones sleep in center of group, surrounded by adults. Maximum heat efficiency. Like emperor penguins on Earth," Mike mused. "They huddle together to survive Antarctic winters." "Yes, exactly." Vex's excitement made their fur puff up slightly. "I have studied Earth wildlife. Many good examples of thermal sharing. Humans are unusual. You build artificial heat instead of sharing natural heat." "Well, we're not exactly equipped for it like your species is," Mike pointed out. "No fur, for one thing." "True. But you create artificial fur. Many layers. Very inefficient compared to biological solution." Vex paused thoughtfully. "Perhaps this is why humans explore space, always trying to solve problems with technology." Another system failed somewhere in the station, but this time Mike didn't try to get up. The warmth was making him drowsy, and he was starting to understand why Vex's species found this normal. There was something fundamentally comforting about it, once you got past the strangeness. "Your body temperature is stabilizing," Vex noted with satisfaction. "Heart rate lowering. Good signs." "Thanks to you," Mike admitted. "I probably would have frozen by now otherwise." "No thanks needed. Is duty. Is right thing to do." Vex's silver eyes blinked slowly. "Though I admit, did not expect first close contact with human to be like this." Mike couldn't help but laugh. "I don't think anyone could have expected this. Definitely wasn't in the job description." "Life is full of unexpected situations," Vex said sagely. "Mark of intelligence is adapting to them." The emergency lights dimmed further, leaving them in near darkness. The cold pressed against the bubble of warmth they had created, but couldn't penetrate it. Mike found himself drifting toward sleep, his body finally accepting that it was safe. "Rest," Vex whispered. "I will maintain watch. Will wake you if anything changes." Mike nodded sleepily. His last conscious thought was that when this was all over, he was going to have a very interesting report to write for headquarters. Mike drifted in and out of sleep, his mind struggling between exhaustion and the strangeness of his situation. Each time he woke, Vex was still there, radiating steady warmth. their silver eyes glowing softly in the darkness. "You should continue sleeping," Vex said during one of Mike's wakeful periods. "Body heals better during rest." "Can't help it," Mike replied, shifting slightly. "Keep thinking about all the systems we need to check once power's back." "Always thinking of work," Vex observed. "Typical human trait. My people say rest is as important as work." The station had grown eerily quiet. Most systems were either frozen or shut down, leaving only the occasional creak of metal and the soft sound of their breathing. "Tell me about your first space flight," Vex said suddenly. "Humans always have interesting stories about first time leaving their world." Mike smiled at the memory. "Actually, I threw up. Turns out reading about zero gravity and experiencing it are two very different things." Yes, many species have similar reactions. My first flight, I shed much fur from stress. Very embarrassing." They both chuckled, the sound echoing strangely in the dark control room. "You know," Mike said thoughtfully, "I always wondered why your species joined the Deep Space Mining Coalition. Your technology was already more advanced than ours in many ways." Vex's fur rippled in what Mike had learned was their equivalent of a shrug. Advanced technology does not equal advanced understanding. Humans bring different perspective. You see solutions where we see problems. Like using explosives for mining. Mike grinned, remembering the horror on Vex's face when they first learned about human mining techniques. "Yes, very crude, very dangerous, very effective." Vex's voice carried a mix of disapproval and admiration. "My people would never think to solve problem by making bigger problem." Another system failed somewhere in the station with a distant thud. Mike tensed, but Vex's gentle pressure kept him from getting up. "Cannot fix everything," Vex reminded him. "Must choose battles wisely." "That's rich coming from someone who insisted on saving me," Mike pointed out. "Different situation. You are not machine. Cannot be replaced or repaired. Must be preserved." The simple sincerity in Vex's voice made Mike fall silent. He'd worked with various alien species over the years, but none had shown this level of concern for human life. "In my culture," Vex continued, "we have saying, heat shared is life shared. When we share warmth, we also share stories, memories, wisdom, is why thermal sharing is sacred." "We have similar sayings on Earth," Mike said, "about sharing breaking down barriers between people." "Yes, exactly same concept. Different words, same truth." Vex's excitement made their fur puff up again, creating an even warmer cocoon around Mike. They fell into comfortable silence for a while, listening to the station's creaks and groans. Mike found himself thinking about how quickly the situation had gone from awkward to almost normal. "Your species adapts quickly," Vex observed, as if reading his thoughts. "Few hours ago, you were embarrassed. Now you are comfortable." "Well, freezing to death tends to change your priorities," Mike said dryly. "Besides, you're surprisingly comfortable for a giant space kangaroo." Vex made their characteristic chirping sound that indicated amusement. "And you are surprisingly resilient for a furless primate." The emergency lights flickered again, threatening to give out completely. The temperature display had stopped working hours ago, but Mike could feel the bitter cold pressing against Vex's bubble of warmth. "How long do you think until help arrives?" he asked. "Based on standard response times and current solar interference, perhaps 6 more hours." Vex's tone was matter-of-fact. "We have sufficient oxygen. Have warmth. We'll survive." Mike nodded, feeling oddly peaceful despite their situation. "Thanks, Vex, for everything." "No thanks needed, remember. Is duty, is right thing." Vex paused, then added, "But you are welcome, friend Mike." It was the first time Vex had used the word friend, and somehow it felt perfectly natural. As Mike drifted back to sleep, he realized that sometimes the strangest situations could lead to the most genuine connections. The emergency lights had finally given up, leaving Mike and Vex in almost complete darkness. Only the faint glow from Vex's silver eyes and the occasional spark from damaged equipment provided any illumination. Incoming transmission, Vex announced suddenly, their sensitive ears picking up the faint beep from the communication console. Very weak signal. Mike tried to get up, but his limbs were stiff from cold and inactivity. Vex carefully helped him stand, keeping one arm around him to maintain the vital warmth as they moved to the console together. Through bursts of static, a voice crackled. Delta 7, rescue shuttle. ETA 3 hours. Hold position. They're coming, Mike said, relief flooding through him. But 3 hours is a long time with these temperatures. We have survived this long, Vex pointed out. We'll survive longer, but must preserve remaining power for communication. As if on cue, another system failed, sending cascading sparks across the room. The backup life support system made an ominous whining sound. That's not good, Mike muttered, studying the readings. Oxygen recycling is down to 20% efficiency. We need to reduce our consumption. Vex's ears twitched thoughtfully. My species can enter low energy state, reduce oxygen needs, but must maintain body heat for you. Can you do both? We'll try. Never attempted with human before. Very interesting experiment. Mike couldn't help but laugh. Glad my potential freezing death is scientifically interesting to you. They made their way back to their corner, where Vex helped Mike settle before curling around him again. The alien's breathing slowed noticeably, their fur taking on a slightly different texture. We'll maintain minimum necessary heat, Vex said, their voice becoming slower and more melodic. Tell me if temperature drops too low. The next hour passed in tense silence. Mike could feel the cold growing more intense as more systems failed, but Vex's warmth remained steady, a barrier between him and the freezing void that their station had become. Another transmission crackled through. Delta 7. Solar storm intensifying. Delay possible. Maintain life support. Delay not acceptable, Vex said, their voice suddenly alert. Your body cannot sustain these conditions indefinitely. Mike checked the last working display. Oxygen levels are still dropping. Even with you in low energy state, we're using it faster than the system can recycle it. Then must think like human, Vex declared. Must find unexpected solution. What do you mean? You said humans solve problems by making bigger problems. Perhaps we should try this approach. Mike turned this idea over in his mind. You mean like how we used explosives for mining? Creating a controlled problem to solve a bigger one? Yes. What systems remain that could be safely destroyed to help others? It was such an alien suggestion, literally, that Mike almost dismissed it. But as he thought about it, an idea began to form. The mining drone bay, he said slowly. It has its own power and oxygen supply for emergency launches. If we vent it, the rush of oxygen would replenish our supplies, Vex finished. Would lose valuable equipment. But we'd survive longer, Mike completed. That's very human thinking for you, Vex. Learning from your species, though still think explosives unnecessary. Working together, they'd managed to access the drone bay controls. The process was slow. Mike's fingers were still clumsy with cold, and Vex had to maintain constant contact to keep him warm enough to function. Ready? Mike asked, his hand hovering over the emergency vent control. Ready, though if this fails, will be very embarrassing report to write. If this fails, we won't be writing any reports, Mike pointed out. He pressed the button. The station shuddered as the drone bay depressurized, and for a terrifying moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the oxygen readings began to climb. It worked, Mike exclaimed. We just bought ourselves at least 2 more hours of air. Very human solution, Vex observed. Create destruction to ensure survival. Surprisingly effective. They made their way back to their corner, where Vex resumed their low-energy state. As Mike settled back into the warmth, he realized something had changed. They weren't just two beings thrown together by circumstance anymore. They were partners finding solutions together. "Rest now," Vex murmured. "Still long wait ahead. But we will survive. Humans always survive." The next transmission came through clearer than before, suggesting the solar storm was finally weakening. "Delta 7, rescue shuttle approaching your sector. Stand by for emergency protocols." Mike and Vex had remained in their corner, conserving both heat and oxygen. The station around them had grown even colder, with ice crystals forming on the walls and equipment. "Your media will have much to say about this," Vex observed, their silver eyes twinkling with amusement. "Human and alien sharing thermal contact. Very unusual story." "Oh God," Mike groaned, suddenly realizing the implications. "The headlines are going to be terrible. Human cuddles alien to survive, or something equally embarrassing." "My species' news networks will be worse," Vex replied. "We'll focus on spiritual significance of thermal sharing with new species. Many religious leaders will want to meet you." "Wait, what?" Mike twisted around to look at Vex. "Religious leaders. Of course. First documented thermal sharing between our species. Very important cultural moment. Will probably be included in teaching materials for young ones." Mike let his head fall back with a thud. "Fantastic. I'm going to be in alien textbooks." Another transmission crackled through. "Delta 7, preparing for emergency dock. All personnel move to primary airlock." "Not yet," Vex said firmly when Mike tried to move. "Must wait until last moment. Still too cold in corridors." They sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the distant sounds of the rescue shuttle maneuvering into position. Mike found himself oddly reluctant to end their unusual arrangement. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "this whole situation might actually help improve relations between our species, show that we can literally survive together." "Yes," Vex agreed, "though some will be shocked. My species very traditional about thermal sharing, usually reserved for family groups and closest friends. So I've basically been adopted into your family," Mike joked. "In way, yes," Vex replied seriously. "Survival bond is considered sacred. You are now connected to my family line." Mike blinked, surprised by this information. "You're not kidding, are you?" "Never kid about thermal bonds. We'll need to inform my family elders. They will want to meet you at next gathering." Before Mike could process this new development, the station shuddered as the rescue shuttle made contact. The airlock's communication system crackled to life. "Delta 7, ready for emergency evacuation. Please confirm status." Mike started to respond, but Vex spoke first. "Two survivors. Require thermal protection for human transfer. Temperature critically low in corridors." There was a pause, then. "Understood. Sending thermal gear through airlock." "Well," Mike said, beginning to untangle himself from Vex's warm fur, "I guess this is it. Back to normal life." "No," Vex corrected him. "Not back to normal. Forward to new normal. Nothing will be same after this." They could hear the rescue team working at the airlock. Soon they would need to make their way there, ending their unusual survival arrangement. "Your species has saying," Vex continued, "about silver linings in clouds. Perhaps this disaster is silver lining. Shows new possibilities for cooperation." Mike nodded, standing carefully as Vex kept a supporting arm around him. "You might be right, though I'm not sure everyone will understand." "Understanding comes with time," Vex said wisely. "First comes survival. Then comes learning. Then comes change." The rescue team's lights could be seen flickering in the corridor now. In moments, their long night would be over, but Mike knew Vex was right. Nothing would be quite the same after this. "Thank you," he said quietly, "not just for keeping me alive, but for showing me a different way of thinking about survival." "And thank you," Vex replied, "for trusting enough to accept help, for showing that humans can adapt, can accept new ways." The rescue team's voices grew closer. Soon, they would be surrounded by people, questions, medical checks, and all the chaos that followed a near disaster in space. But for now, In these last moments of their shared experience, Mike and Vex stood together in the darkness, a living example of how necessity could bridge the gap between worlds. 3 months after the Delta 7 incident, Mike stood before the Interspecies Coalition Council, feeling uncomfortable in his formal uniform. The chamber was filled with representatives from various species, all gathered to discuss the implications of what had happened on that frozen night. The incident has led to significant revisions in emergency protocols, the human chairperson announced. All deep space stations will now be required to consider species-specific survival techniques in their emergency planning. Mike caught Vex's eye from across the chamber. The alien's fur was neatly groomed for the occasion, and they wore the formal sash of an environmental specialist. But their silver eyes still held that same warmth from that long night. Furthermore, the chairperson continued, this event has opened new avenues for biological research into cross-species survival techniques. After the hearing, Mike and Vex met in one of the station's observation lounges. Earth hung like a blue jewel in the viewport before them. They're making it all sound so official, Mike said, loosening his collar. Protocols and procedures. They're missing the point entirely. Bureaucrats always focus on rules, Vex replied, their musical voice carrying a note of amusement. Cannot write regulations about trust and understanding. The media coverage had been exactly as they'd predicted. Human news networks had sensationalized the story, while Vex's people had turned it into something approaching a religious parable. But beneath all the noise, something important had changed. My family gathering is next month, Vex mentioned casually. Elders still insist you must attend. Cannot refuse thermal bond family. Mike laughed. I still can't believe I'm technically part of your family now. Does this mean I have to learn all your traditions? Only important ones, like proper fur grooming techniques. I don't have any fur. Details, Vex dismissed with a wave of their hand. Principle remained same. They both turned as a group of young cadets passed by, pointing and whispering. The story of their survival had become required reading at the Space Academy, though Mike suspected the official version missed many of the more subtle points. The younger ones understand better, Vex observed. They see possibility, not protocol. Next generation will find new ways to work together. Speaking of working together, Mike said, have you heard about my new assignment? The experimental mixed species mining crew. Vex's ears perked up. Had something to do with that. Recommended you as human supervisor. You did what? Mike stared at his friend. Is that why the assignment came with a note about demonstrated ability to adapt to alien perspectives? Perhaps, Vex replied innocently. Though thermal sharing not required for this position. They shared a laugh, remembering how awkward that first hour had been, and how natural it had seemed by the end. A message flashed on the station's information board, announcing the departure time for the next shuttle to Earth. Mike would be heading back to prepare for his new assignment, while Vex had duties on their homeworld. It's strange, Mike said as they walked toward the shuttle bay. That night could have been just about survival. Instead, it became about understanding. Not strange, Vex corrected. Natural. When barriers fall away, truth remains. All species seek connection, understanding. Sometimes takes crisis to show this. They reached the departure point, where other passengers were already boarding the shuttle. Mike turned to his friend. His family, according to Vex's culture. Next time we meet, no freezing temperatures required, he said with a smile. Agreed. Though thermal sharing always available if needed. Vex's eyes twinkled with mischief. For family. As Mike boarded the shuttle, he reflected on how one desperate night had changed so much. The protocols and procedures being written were important, but the real change was happening in moments like this. In friendships forged across species, in barriers broken down, in understanding gained. The shuttle lifted off, and Mike watched Vex's tall figure grow smaller through the viewport. Somewhere in the vastness of space, a human and an alien had shared warmth to survive, and in doing so, had shown both their species a new way forward. Sometimes, Mike thought, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, even if those moments involve cuddling up to an 8-foot-tall alien to avoid freezing to death.